Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where we journey through the week ahead with electional astrology. It's Monday. If you're a returning viewer of the channel, you know that I release these videos every Monday, so you can always look forward to them. I know I always look forward to them, so thank you for coming back, liking, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps me out. Before diving into the elections for the week, I want to invite you to work with me one-on-one, whether for a tutoring session, if you're exploring electional astrology and you want some one-on-one help to go through some elections together. And I can give you some personal attention to see what kinds of charts you're choosing and any tips or tricks I might have for you based on what you're doing right now. Additionally, I personalize elections for people. So if you've got a project coming up, maybe in the next couple months or in the next several months that you want to plan for and get a timeline set up for, electional astrology is great for giving us something to focus on. We get these charts and then we get our imagination going. And oftentimes I find that it helps us fill in the blanks. Like if you have a project that you're planning, the chart can help you elaborate on your project based on the symbols of the chart. You can actually get some ideas about how to move forward. So you can meet with me to discuss a personal plan for you and your elections at some links in the video description below, as well as checking out the tutoring sessions that I'm offering too. A question that I get every week that I want to address right out the gate is that you don't have to adjust for your time zone. So if I say, for example, 7 a.m. on Wednesday, just do 7 a.m. on Wednesday, regardless of where in the world you are. Now, with that, you do want to pull up the chart for that in your location and make sure that you have the same ascendant degree that I'm talking about. And if you don't, then you just want to adjust the time until you do have the same ascendant degree. Another thing that will happen is that the moon in your location may be in a different spot. And so what you want to check for with that is the moon in the same sign that I'm talking about? And is the moon making the same contacts with other planets that I'm talking about? If it's not, then you need to check what those other contacts the moon is making are in order to make sure that that's not drastically changing things. And unfortunately, I can't share the charts for like every location. So this does require a little bit of independence on your part. Being able to identify aspects in particular is so important for electional astrology. And so I would love to help you out with that in a tutoring session. The charts for this week focus a lot on the mutable rising signs. And that's because Mercury is now direct and Jupiter is super strong. So with mutable rising signs, that means that Mercury and Jupiter are going to be ruling the most important places in the chart. And because Mercury and Jupiter are in pretty good shape right now, we're going to take advantage of that by highlighting mutable rising signs. Aries rising is also a pretty good option because Mars is exalted in Capricorn and it has some really nice aspects. So you'll see what I'm talking about with the charts. Let's get after it. Our first chart for the week is Tuesday, February 8th at 6:46 p.m. It has about 8 degrees of Virgo rising. The moon is in Taurus, and the moon is moving into a trine with Mercury, who is the ruler of the ascendant. This chart puts a lot of emphasis on the fifth house. There are 3 traditional planets in the fifth house being the place of creativity, pleasure, recreation, and sex. So this is a chart that is very erotic. And by erotic, I don't just mean sexy or sexual. I mean something that pulls you through attraction, something that you want to be close to, something that feels magnetic and like it's pulling you toward it. One of the really supportive things in this chart is Jupiter sitting right on the descendant. And so this points to a really helpful other person. It could play out in a sexual way where this other person is somebody who you really trust. And so you can use this chart for a situation where there is somebody who you really trust and somebody who you know is going to support you to explore your fifth house things. If you're sharing creative work, this is a chart where that creative work will be received with open arms. The ruler of the 8th house is Mars, and it is exalted in the 5th. And so this connection between the 5th and the 8th house could also point to a creative collaboration. Depending on your location, the moon may be conjunct Algol, which is a star that has a lot to do with justice and also protection. The moon is also with the North Node, which is typically an influence that traditionally we are told to avoid because the node is one of the places where the light of the moon gets blocked out, at least when it's in a full or a new moon. And so the node can be a little bit confounding. There can be a sense of not being able to see things entirely clearly. And so this chart puts a lot of emphasis on trust. Are you in a situation where you trust? Even if you don't see things entirely clearly, or you don't know what the future holds, do you trust that you're in a relationship that can support you to explore that? Notice I'm asking these as questions. Remember that putting your faith in somebody else is a choice. And so if you use this chart, you are making a choice to trust somebody else. And with the Sun-Saturn conjunction in the 6th house of this chart, we need to recognize that we are taking responsibility for the consequences of our choices to trust. Our second chart for the week is Wednesday, February 9th at about 7:44 a.m. with 8 or 9 degrees of Pisces rising. The moon is in Gemini, moving into a square with Jupiter, who rules the ascendant and is placed on the ascendant. So we've got another Pisces rising with Jupiter in Pisces. Y'all know the deal. This chart makes me think about the idea of inflation. And I don't just mean economic inflation, although maybe that's part of the story for you. I mean the inflation of self, the inflation of a hot air balloon that gently rises into the sky, and the beauty of looking at things from this height. From high up in this hot air balloon, you look down and you might see at a distance the ways that people are continuing to live their life, but you can't hear them. And from this height, things are so beautiful. Things are perfect even. There's this peace and this silence up at this height. Maybe all you can hear is the wind. And the reason I'm focusing on this idea of inflation and rising is because at this point in the week, the moon is really waxing. The moon is in its second quarter, which is where it's picking up a lot of momentum. It's gaining a lot of light. And this moon is contacting the ruler of the ascendant, which is placed on the ascendant. And so there's a sense in which this individual or this group who's initiating this action, who's pushing this idea forward, is really rising and being filled with something, just like the moon itself is being filled. Maybe that filling is with confidence. Maybe that filling is with hope. Maybe that filling is with aspiration and self-belief. Again, with this Pisces rising, as we have seen in previous weeks, there is still a lot of activity going on in the 11th house, but unlike in previous Pisces risings that we've been looking at, all of the planets are direct in motion. So there is a sense, again, of pushing forward and continuing momentum, gaining in speed, gaining in light. So this chart has a lot of direction and push behind it. These 11th house planets, once again, do point to alliance making, making friends, building an audience. We also see that the ruler of the 7th house, Mercury, is placed in the 11th. And so this points to important one-on-one partners or individuals who you're partnering with in a sort of contractual way are supporting you because they're in the 11th house, where we can kind of collaborate on our shared hopes and wishes. The ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 7th house share a sign-based aspect by sextile. And so this is really good for showing that there is an opportunity to collaborate here. Our next chart for the week is Thursday, and lo and behold, it's another Pisces rising. I really love having a Pisces rising on a Thursday in particular because this is the day of Jupiter, and so we're getting a lot of Jupiter in this chart. The moon is once again in Gemini, except this time it's not aspecting Jupiter. Instead, it's aspecting Saturn as its next contact. So what this moon is doing is it's taking light from Jupiter. It's taking this hope and optimism, and it's bringing it to Saturn. So it's in a way formalizing or structuring these things that might otherwise be kind of loosey-goosey. I said loosey-goosey. Maybe that's another thing to focus on with the moon in Gemini, is being a little bit free with your words and seeing where they land. Maybe there's a way in which one way of saying things is not really the point. Maybe you've experimented with multiple ways of saying something, and now through that, you're finding what it is that's going to stick, what it is that's going to have structure, and what you can carry forward into the future in an enduring way. With this chart, I prefer it to be Jupiter's hour. And so that's why the ascendant in this chart is a little bit earlier than in the last chart. So you can find a planetary hour calculator. I like to use, what is the app that I use? Time Nomad. That's the one. Time Nomad is what I use, but you can also just Google like planetary hour calculator and make sure that it's correct and that the sunrise time that is being used in that calculator is correct, and also the sunset time, because that's how planetary hours are calculated. If you have questions about planetary hours, go to my channel. I have a video on it that was previously just for patrons, but I have made public, so check that out. With the moon being conjunct the IC, at least it is in my location, you want to check to see if the moon is conjunct the IC within a few degrees in your location to see if this resonates. This contact between the moon on the IC and Saturn in the 12th does lend itself to some kind of spirit contact potentially, or channeling, or automatic writing, these kinds of contacts with the numinous, contacts with the past, contacts with the dead, and being able to bring language from those places with the moon being in Gemini. And with the moon, again, taking light from Jupiter, the ruler of the ascendant, and sending it to Saturn, this can show that you're maybe more so sending out a message rather than receiving one. Our chart for Friday this week is February 11th at 6:28 p.m. We've got another Virgo rising. This time the moon is in Cancer. If you live in the Western Hemisphere, you can probably get the moon in Cancer for this chart. You might just have to make it slightly later of a Virgo rising if you live on the Pacific coast. So check your chart, make sure that the moon is in Cancer. If the moon's in Gemini, that's actually okay too, because there's not really any problem with that particular moon in Gemini. So that can work as well. Either way, the moon's next aspect is going to be to Jupiter. With the moon waxing at this time, getting really close to being full and contacting Jupiter, there's a sense of your cup running over. Like, this is really a chart where if you have something to communicate emotionally or some way to open your heart, it can be a time when that feels a little bit overwhelming, but like in a happy way. Like, you finally get to share how you really feel about something. If we look at this moon, the moon is really the only planet that's up in the sky. Everything else is below the horizon. And so this emotional expression might feel a little bit lonesome. It might feel a little bit exposed and like it doesn't have a lot of company in this expression. But because that contact of the moon is to Jupiter, it is being received in this really healthy way. And so once again, this is a chart where you can have faith and where you can build trust. Doubling down on that theme of sort of opening your heart and letting it all pour loose, Mercury is conjunct Pluto in this chart. And so it might be about communicating something that is rather deep, especially because that Mercury rules the ascendant. And so it's going to represent you as the individual. Everything that I said about the earlier Virgo rising chart in terms of creativity and fifth house matters is also relevant for this chart. There's a greater emphasis on kind of publicizing those things though, because we have this moon that's, kind of straddling the 10th and the 11th houses. February 12th. Oh, mama, this is quite a chart. This is probably like the crunchiest chart that I've shared in this episode so far. It's February 12th at about 9:05 p.m. It's got a Libra rising. It's ruled by this Venus in the 4th house, and the moon is like smack dab on the midheaven. So you're going to want like around 9 degrees of Libra rising in order to put the moon and Venus both angular. So if that last chart that we looked at where the moon was trining Jupiter was like your cup running over and sharing what you really feel about something, this chart is kind of similar to that, but there is a little bit more tension and there is support still for this kind of emotional expression, but it's going to feel a little bit more erratic. It's going to feel a little bit more out of control because of this opposition between the moon and Venus and also the moon and Mars. With the ruler of the ascendant being conjunct Mars, who rules the 7th, this is showing a very close contact between two people or two organizations. And it's showing that they have a lot of passion for each other. This moon is really heating up and activating that connection. In terms of heat, we can also notice that this moon is conjunct the fixed star Sirius, which sits at about 14 degrees of Cancer. And Sirius is known as a very hot star. Like, people who have placements conjunct Sirius tend to burn really hot, and they can burn so hot that they end up burning themselves in the process. I was watching a Netflix documentary about this climber, this mountain climber who was incredibly prolific. And he climbed all of this shit that nobody thought was even possible, to do these incredible mountain climbs with like no ropes and entirely solo. And this guy has Mars, the planet of like athleticism, conjunct the fixed star Sirius. And so while he did kind of reach these heights and reach these physical achievements, he ended up dying in an avalanche. So there's this sense in which with Sirius, sometimes you can really reach for the stars, but there can be a cost of that. And so that's one thing to keep in mind with this chart, is like, are you burning too hot? Is there a craving for some kind of immortality that is shaping your actions, or shaping especially your public actions and what you're kind of putting out there for the public to see? So this moon in the 10th can be really good for public appeal, actually. And as much as this chart is about that public appeal, it's also about what's going on in private, what's going on in the fourth house between two people. We could also look at this Mars as simply, really activating Venus, like making Venus do Venus things, love, relationship, aesthetics, in a very direct way and in a very ambitious way. So one of the themes of this chart is definitely ambition between Sirius and between the prominence of Mars. And so our next chart for February 13th, I kind of cheated a little bit because this is at 12:05 a.m. on February 13th, which is funny because it's only like an hour or two later than the previous chart. So we've just clicked from Libra rising at the very end of February 12th into Scorpio rising on the very beginning of February 13th. So we still have the moon opposite this Venus-Mars conjunction, but instead of Venus ruling the ascendant, here we have Mars ruling the ascendant. And so this chart becomes a lot more approachable, I would say. It's less intense than the last one. Rather than having angular planets with like, everything sitting on either the IC or the MC, here we have all of those same planets in cadent houses. And cadent houses are about reflecting, looking back on things, telling stories in this case with the 3rd and the 9th house, organizing people in local community, and sharing beliefs with people with the moon in the 9th house. This is a really good chart for enjoyment. We see this Jupiter in Pisces in the 5th. So with the ruler of the ascendant being this exalted Mars, this chart is just so supportive and exalting for the individual or the group taking this action. There's a sense of that entity being lifted up and respected and receiving the support not only of other people, but also the support of the youth. We see that Mars is, yes, it's conjunct Venus, but it's also separating from a sextile with Jupiter, who's the ruler of the 5th house. And so there's a sense of having the support of students, having the support of the young. We could also look at this Mars as translating light from Jupiter to Venus, which is from the 5th to the 7th, if we're looking at the rulerships of those planets. So Mars is actively delivering on the promises of creative work or other 5th house topics and delivering it to this Venus, who is really going to respect what Mars is doing because of Mars's exaltation. And this Venus is no slouch either. We can look at Venus and Mars actually both being in the Egyptian terms of Venus, which means that essentially Venus and Mars are both playing by the rules of Venus. So there's an emphasis here in these specific degrees of Capricorn on cooperation. Yes, we are in Capricorn where there's an emphasis on restriction and preservation, and we're doing this in order to support bonds of socialization or bonds of, keeping people together, keeping people cooperative. There's an energy of sharing in this chart, sharing with a local community, sharing through our communication with these kind of 3rd house ideas. And our last chart for the week is Monday, February 14th at 8:37 a.m. with approximately 10 degrees of Aries rising. In my location, the moon is in Leo. It's very possible that in your location, especially if you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, the moon will be in Cancer. And that's okay. For y'all where the moon is still in Cancer, to consider a Pisces rising instead. You're going to have the same idea here where the moon is going to be in the 5th house. So basically, if the moon is in Leo in your location, use an Aries rising to put the moon in the 5th house. And if the moon is in Cancer in your location, use a Pisces rising to put the moon in the 5th house. So this is another Mars chart. We've got Mars ruling the ascendant in the 10th. It's conjunct Venus. So again, we have this really close meeting of two parties, the 1st house ruler and the 7th house ruler. And they're getting along. The same idea applies here, where these planets are placed in the terms of Venus. And so they are using Venusian ways of connecting with each other. They have to play by a very cooperative set of rules. The moon is getting very close to full, and the moon here actually doesn't have an applying aspect. If you're using one of the Cancer moon charts because you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, then the moon will be opposite Mercury, which is going to have maybe a little bit of tension in communication, kind of a standoff between words and feelings where they don't quite match up. With Mercury being at the very end of Capricorn, there may be a sense in which communication is kind of running out. But we do see that Mercury, with it about to switch into Aquarius, it is about to gain dignity, with Mercury having some dignity in an air sign. And so if you use this chart, we can tell that story as communication is about to improve. It's currently worn out. It's currently on its last legs. The language that we've been using in public is about to change, and it's about to improve. So use this for something that's a little bit more temporary if you are focusing on mercurial topics like writing or communication or languaging something that you're doing in this 10th house public space. And that's going to do it for Elections Weekly. So thank you so much for joining me. Once again, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. And if you have any questions about electional astrology or anything else about astrology, drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, love to hear how you're enjoying the videos. If you have any questions, again, I'm pretty much an open book with this stuff. If there's anything that you want to spend a little more time on, again, I am offering those tutoring sessions. I love to teach and I love to meet with people who want to learn. So check it out. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll see you next Monday.